Welcome to the Deep Dive. You know, the world of device management, it's just constantly moving, evolving so fast, staying on top of every single update, every feature, every potential issue. Honestly, it can feel like a full-time job, but that's why we're here. This is the Deep Dive. We cut through all that noise, that information overload, and pull out the really important bits of knowledge, the key insights, basically giving you a shortcut to being genuinely well-informed. Today, our mission is to plunge into the, fascinating and definitely broadening world of Microsoft Intune. It's really not just for Windows anymore, is it? Its capabilities are spreading out, covering a really diverse ecosystem. We'll dig into its core power, look at recent innovations, and tackle some of those trickier scenarios that, frankly, require pretty deep understanding.
That's right. And our goal really is for you to walk away from this deep dive feeling confident, feeling informed about this whole complex landscape of modern endpoint management, but, without feeling totally overwhelmed by just the sheer amount of stuff out there. So get ready for maybe some surprising facts, some aha moments, hopefully.
Okay, so to really get a handle on Intune's power, especially as it evolves, we probably need to start at the beginning. At its absolute core, what does this platform do? And what are those essential building blocks?
Yeah, good place to start. Think of Intune less as just a tool and more like the central nervous system for your organization's digital health, its main job, protecting and managing applications and endpoints, all of them across the whole organization. And what people sometimes miss is how it goes beyond just managing devices. It's actively protecting the data, the applications wherever they are. And crucially, it doesn't work in isolation. It really stands on three key pillars.
Three pillars. Okay, walk us through those.
Absolutely. So first, there's Microsoft Intune itself that handles the core device management, compliance checks, that sort of thing. Then Microsoft Intra ID. This is completely essential for identity, obviously, but especially for conditional access policies. Can't do that without it. And finally, Microsoft Edge. It might seem like just a browser, but it rounds out the trio by providing protected, managed access to Microsoft 365 web apps. These three, they really work together in concert to give you that unified management experience.
Right, okay. So imagine you're an admin just starting out with Intune. What are those first critical steps to get your tenant ready? I mean, there must be foundational work before you even think about enrolling the first device.
Oh, absolutely. Foundational is the right word. For Intune admins, those first crucial steps are adding your users and groups, making sure you assign the right licenses to the right people, and then setting the Mobile Device Management Authority, the MDM authority. That tells Intune it's in charge. Now, it's really tempting, especially when you're new, to just grant yourself, global admin rights to make things quicker.
Yeah. I can see that.
But the real insight, the best practice, is that Intune actually gives you specific built-in roles, like the policy and profile manager. Using this kind of least privileged role for tasks like device enrollment is honestly a critical security step. It means you're not overprivileged, and you reduce your potential attack surface right from day one.
That's smart. A really good security practice. Beyond the pure technical setup, is there a strategic element admins should be thinking about? Planning.
Yes, definitely. Strategic planning is vital. We highly recommend using the Microsoft Intune Planning Guide. It helps you define your goals for device management, your specific use cases, your requirements. It shapes the whole rollout.
Makes sense.
And speaking of rollout, communication is key. You absolutely need a clear plan for your employees or maybe students. They need to understand how to install and use things like the company portal app and Microsoft Edge on their devices. Clear guidance just smooths out the whole process, enrollment, ongoing use, everything. Reduces help desk calls too.
Right. Okay. So foundations are laid, planning's done. Now we can start really building up the security posture. This is where things like compliance and endpoint policies come in and where it can get pretty dynamic, right? How do those device compliance policies actually work? How do they ensure devices meet the standards?
They're absolutely critical. Device compliance policies are how you ensure that any device trying to access your organization's data is secure and meets the standards you define. If a device doesn't meet those requirements, maybe the OS is outdated, maybe encryption's off, and Intune marks it as non-compliant, and then you get to configure what happens next. These are called actions for non-compliance.
Actions like what?
Well, they can range quite a bit. You could send notifications to the user, maybe give them a grace period to fix it, or you could restrict their access to company resources. Or, in more serious cases, you could even trigger a remote wipe of the device. It gives you control.
And what's the user typically experience? Is it like, bam, you're blocked? Or is there a chance to fix things?
It really depends on how you set up those actions. You can definitely configure it to be user-friendly first. Start with a notification, maybe link them to instructions, give them that grace period you mentioned to, say, update their OS or turn on encryption. Only if they don't comply within that time, or maybe for a really severe issue, would you then escalate to restricting access or something more drastic like a wipe. It's always that balance, isn't it? Security versus user productivity.
Definitely. Okay, and I know Intune's reach is expanding. What about Linux? How does compliance work specifically for Linux devices?
Yeah, Linux support is getting much better. For Linux devices, compliance policies can actually be quite granular now. You can enforce policies based on the specific Linux distribution, the version they're running, whether device encryption is enabled, or even things like password complexity. But what's really flexible, and I think quite powerful, is the ability to add custom compliance settings.
Custom settings, how does that work?
Basically, if there's a specific check you need to run that isn't built in natively, you can write your own bash scripts. Intune runs the script, checks the output, and determines compliance based on that. It gives you that extensibility for niche requirements.
That's really useful. Okay, so you have these compliance policies checking the device state.
Yeah.
How do they then link up with something like conditional access?
This is where the real power lies. It's the synergy. Microsoft Entra conditional access policies work hand in hand, in conjunction with Intune's device compliance policies. Think of conditional access as the gatekeeper to your cloud apps and data. So a conditional access policy could say, for instance, block sign-in to Microsoft 365 web apps and Edge unless the device is enrolled in Intune and marked as compliant by Intune. It connects the device state directly to access rights. Only trusted, healthy devices get in.
Right, that makes perfect sense. Now, beyond those general device configuration settings, I've heard about specialized endpoint security policies. How are they different? What specific security areas do they target?
Yeah, that's a good distinction to make. These specialized endpoint security policies are different because they focus on specific subsets of device security. They're more targeted, more focused than the broad device configuration profiles. So, for example, you'll find dedicated policies just for disk encryption. These manage the built-in methods like File Vault on macOS or BitLocker and personal data encryption on Windows. There are also specific policies just for managing the built-in firewalls on macOS and Windows, and critically, policies for endpoint detection and response, or EDR. These handle settings for Microsoft Defender for Endpoint and actually onboard devices to it.
Okay, so it's like drilling down into specific security layers with dedicated tools. Are there other important types of these specialized policies?
Yeah, a few others worth mentioning. There are policies specifically for attack surface reduction ASR rules. These are mostly relevant when you're using Defender antivirus on your Windows machines. And then there's App Control for Business, which used to be WGAC. That's all about managing exactly which applications are allowed to run on your Windows devices. So they all give security admins that really focus control over key security areas.
Okay, this next point feels really important, something any admin needs to understand. Conflicts. What happens when, say, different policies try to manage the very same setting? How does Intune figure that out? And crucially, what does the admin see? Does it just break?
Conflicts. Yes, this is a common source of headaches, shall we say. It happens when you try to manage the exact same setting from multiple places. That could be different types of policies like a security baseline, a device config profile, and an endpoint security policy, all hitting the same registry key. Or it could even be multiple instances of the same policy type assigned to the same user or device, but with conflicting values.
And the result?
When Intune detects these conflicting configurations trying to apply to a device, the setting can actually just fail. It won't apply at all. What you'll typically see in the Intune Admin Center is a conflict status reported for that specific setting on that device. Or sometimes it might just show as pending indefinitely, or maybe even an error. It makes it pretty clear something's wrong, but figuring out which policies are conflicting requires some digging. And adding to the fun, security baselines often set non-default values for things, whereas other policy types might default to not configured, which adds another layer of complexity when troubleshooting.
Okay, so careful planning, understanding policy precedents, and using the reporting tools are absolutely key there. How does role-based access control RBAC fit into managing these endpoint security policies? Is it granular?
It is, and it's actually become more granular recently. RBAC gives you fine-grained permissions for who can manage what. Just recently, around June 2024, Intune started rolling out even more granular permissions specifically for the individual endpoint security workloads like EDR, disk encryption, etc. This means some rights are being moved away from the broader, older security baselines permission into these more specific areas.
Some more precise control.
Exactly. It allows for better separation of duties. And there are built-in roles designed for this, like the Endpoint Security Manager, which aligns well with these focused security tasks.
Okay, that brings us nicely to another really complex but totally fundamental area: onboarding devices, enrollment. Let's dive into the specifics here, maybe starting with Linux again. What are the details around getting a Linux desktop enrolled?
Right. For Linux enrollment, Intune currently supports specific versions. That's Ubuntu LTS long-term support versions 24.04, 22.04, or 20.04, and also Red Hat Enterprise Linux versions 8 and 9. The process itself involves the employee installing two things: the Microsoft Intune app and the Microsoft Edge browser on their Linux machine. During that enrollment process, the device gets registered with Microsoft Entra ID, and it's immediately evaluated against any compliance policies you've assigned. A good tip for admins is to advise users, if encryption is required by policy, to maybe encrypt their device before starting the enrollment. It's often simpler that way. And also make sure the OS version and any password requirements are clearly communicated beforehand.
Good practical tips. Now, let's tackle the big one, the challenging path. Windows Autopilot Hybrid Entra ID join. I understand there's a pretty important caveat we need to mention up front here.
You've hit on a really crucial point, yes. It is very important to state clearly that Microsoft no longer recommends using hybrid Entra ID join devices. They strongly push for pure Entra ID join.
Right.
However, the reality is many organizations still have these hybrid setups for various reasons. They're complex, the documentation can sometimes feel contradictory. So this deep dive acknowledges that reality. We're aiming to clarify the setup and pitfalls for those who are still working with it, despite the official recommendation.
Right, so for those organizations navigating this hybrid path, what are the essential prerequisites, the high-level things you need?
Okay, for Windows Autopilot Hybrid Join, you need Windows devices, specifically version 10, 1809, or later. You absolutely need a Windows Server 2016 or newer that's joined to your local domain. This server hosts the Intune offline domain join connector, the ODJ connector. Naturally, you need a working local Active Directory domain controller. And you must have Hybrid Entra ID join configured already using the Azure AD Connect tool or Entra Connect Now to sync your devices up to the cloud. And here's a critical networking piece. The device itself, during autopilot, needs a direct line of sight to that local domain controller.
Line of sight, so on the corporate network?
Exactly. Or alternatively, you need a pre-configured always-on VPN connection that establishes before the user logs in. That network connectivity is non-negotiable.
Wow, okay, so that dependency on the local DC really highlights the hybrid complexity. It's bridging the on-prem AD world with cloud-based Intune management. Are there common mistakes made on that server-side configuration beyond just installing the connector?
Oh, definitely. Beyond just setting up AD Connect Sync and installing the Intune connector, and you can install multiple connectors for high availability, by the way, a critical step that's often missed or done incorrectly for hybrid join is configuring delegated control in your local Active Directory. You have to go to the organizational unit, the OU, where your autopilot computer objects will be created, and you need to grant very specific minimal permissions to the computer count of the server where the Intune connector is installed.
Specific permissions like what?
Things like the permission to create and delete computer objects within that specific OU, maybe full control just on computer objects. You need to follow the documentation precisely. Granting too few permissions means the domain join fails. Granting too many, like domain admin rights, is a massive security risk. And finally, on the server side, you often set up a group policy object, a GPO, linked to your domain to enable automatic MDM enrollment using user credentials specifically.
That is a lot of intricate server-side setup.
Yeah.
Okay, what about the Intune side then? How do you configure things there, and are there specific pitfalls to avoid in the Intune portal itself?
Right. So in the Intune portal, you'll create an autopilot deployment profile, specifically configured for hybrid Entra ID join. And you also need a separate domain join configuration profile. This tells the device which domain to join and which OU to use. Now, for a major pitfall, a real gotcha. Application control policies, like app locker, or WDAC policies. These should not be assigned to devices during the autopilot pre-provisioning phase, also called white glove, or during the main hybrid autopilot process itself. Why? Because they can actually interfere and break the enrollment.
Wow, okay. That's a critical warning.
Yeah. Also, be a bit careful with delivery optimization policies. Sometimes they can also interfere with autopilot enrollments, especially if they're overly aggressive. Needs careful testing.
Good, heads up. Now, how can administrators make this slightly less painful? Can dynamic groups help automate things in this complex hybrid world?
Dynamic device groups in Entri ID are your friend here. Definitely. They are incredibly useful. You can set up rules based on device attributes, particularly the group tag you can assign when importing autopilot devices. So you could have a rule like, if the group tag contains hybrid, automatically add the device to this group. Then you assign all your hybrid join profiles, your configuration profiles, maybe specific apps to that dynamic group. It hugely reduces manual assignment work.
And how do devices get into autopilot in the first place for this?
Several ways. Admins can manually upload a CSV file containing the hardware hash of the device. Or, more commonly for new devices, your hardware vendor or reseller can register the devices directly into your autopilot service. There's also an option within the deployment profile to convert all targeted devices to autopilot, but that's generally used more for existing devices and needs careful planning.
Okay, this feels like where the rubber meets the road, or maybe where the wheels fall off sometimes. What are some of the most critical common breakpoints? The errors people hit during this hybrid Entra ID join process, and crucially, what are the solutions or key insights?
Right. This is where the complexity really bites. One very common breakpoint is seeing an error related to the ODJ blob timeout. ODJ stands for offline domain join. The timeout happens if the Intune service can't find a domain join configuration profile correctly targeted to the device group. The device basically sits there waiting for instructions on how to join the domain and eventually just times out. So ensuring that profile is correctly created and assigned is crucial.
Okay, ODJ blob timeout. What about the enrollment status page, the ESP? I've heard whispers that can cause trouble too.
Whispers are accurate, yes. This is a really key insight, often counterintuitive for people used to standard Entra join. The enrollment status page, which normally tracks app installs and policy application during setup, can frequently cause timeouts specifically in hybrid Entra ID join scenarios. The complexity of waiting for the domain join, then policy sync, often clashes with the ESP timers. So the strong recommendation, strange as it sounds, is to not assign an ESP profile to your devices undergoing Intune autopilot hybrid Entra ID join. Just skip it for these devices.
Don't assign an ESP page for hybrid. Wow. Okay, that's definitely a nugget of knowledge, probably saving someone hours of troubleshooting right there. What about seeing devices that seem to exist in two states, like Entra registered and Entra hybrid join at the same time?
Ah, yes, the dual state devices. That's a very common observation. You look in Entra ID, and the same device appears twice. Once as Microsoft Entra registered, and once as Microsoft Entra hybrid joined. The good news is, the hybrid join state is the one that takes precedence for policy application and conditional access usually. The registered entry is often a leftover from an earlier part of the process or maybe user activity, and in many cases it can be safely deleted once the hybrid join is confirmed. There's actually a registry key you can set via Intune policy blockade workplace join to try and prevent this dual registration from happening in the first place. But remember, the hybrid join process isn't fully complete until a user successfully logs into the device while it has that line of sight to a domain controller. That final step confirms the join.
Right, that DC check-in is vital.
Sure.
Are there any other specific, maybe cryptic error codes or common issues that pop up frequently in this hybrid enrollment scenario?
Oh, there are plenty. But one specific error code that comes up a lot with hybrid join is 0x800 70774.
0x800 70774. Okay, what does that usually mean?
It typically translates to something like, the operation failed because the domain controller could not be contacted or the device couldn't join the domain for some reason. Network issues, DNS problems, the usual suspects. But there's a critical Intune configuration cause that's often overlooked. It relates to the assign user setting within the autopilot deployment profile. If you configure the assign user setting in a profile that's set for hybrid Microsoft Entra join, that can trigger this 0x800 70774 error.
Why?
Because that assign user feature is really designed for and should only be used in standard Microsoft Entra join scenarios. user-driven mode, it conflicts with the hybrid join flow. So the solution is either to remove the user assignment from the hybrid profile or, more fundamentally, ensure your AD permissions delegation for the ODJ connector computer account is set up absolutely correctly, as we discussed earlier. It really underscores how careful you have to be with every single setting in these hybrid scenarios.
Absolutely. That's incredibly detailed and helpful for anyone wrestling with hybrid join. Thanks. Let's shift gears a bit now, looking beyond the immediate setup challenges towards more advanced capabilities and what's coming down the pipeline. What exactly is Intune Advanced Analytics? What kind of deeper insights does it offer admins?
Intune Advanced Analytics is a set of premium features designed to give you, deeper insights for troubleshooting and proactive monitoring. It's an add-on capability. It includes things like an enhanced device timeline. This logs more events related to a device's life cycle and configuration changes with lower latency, making it easier to pinpoint when and why something went wrong. There's also a feature called Device Query. This lets you run Custo Query Language KQL queries against your devices in near real time to get current state and configuration data. Very powerful for ad hoc investigations.
Near real-time data. That sounds useful. Anything else in advanced analytics?
Yes, there's also a battery health report. This might sound minor, but poor battery life is a major user experience drag. This report helps identify devices with degrading batteries proactively. It all integrates tightly with the existing endpoint analytics features in Intune. But importantly, it does require an additional license, either the full Microsoft Intune suite, or you can license some advanced analytics features individually as add-ons.
Good to know about the licensing. Okay, Intune is always evolving. What are some of the really notable recent what's new highlights, things that show the direction it's heading?
There have been quite a few significant updates recently. Yeah, we already touched on Linux, but specifically, Intune recently added support for the latest Ubuntu 24.04 LTS. That keeps it current. A big one for application deployment is the addition of ARM64 support for Win32 applications. This means you can now deploy traditional Win32 apps packaged for Intune to Windows devices running on ARM64 processors. Like many newer Surface devices, that was a gap before.
That ARM64 support is definitely significant. What about security features?
Endpoint Privilege Management, or EPM, which lets standard users run specific tasks with elevation, has seen enhancements. They've added deny rules, so you can explicitly block certain elevations, and they've added support for matching based on command line file arguments, giving you more granular control over exactly what elevated process is allowed to do.
Any other standout recent features admins should really know about?
Yeah, a few more. There's a new vulnerability remediation agent. It's currently in public preview, but it uses data from Microsoft Defender Vulnerability Management to give you prioritized remediation guidance right within Intune and potentially audit some remediation tasks in the future. Also, something called cross-platform device inventory. Intune now collects a default set of hardware inventory data for not just Windows, but also Android, iOS, and Mac devices, giving broader visibility in one place. Windows LAPS, the local administrator password solution policy in Intune, got some new settings and options, improving security for those local admin accounts. And for those using Device Query, there's now a Copilot assistant. You can actually use natural language to ask Copilot to generate the KQL queries for you, which lowers the barrier to entry for using that powerful feature.
Copilot generating KQL, that's interesting. Any RBAC changes?
Yes. One more RBAC tweak related to enrollment restrictions. Creating and editing the policies that limit how many or what type of devices a user can enroll now requires the full Intune administrator role. The policy and profile manager role, which could do this before, now only has read-only access to those specific policies. A bit more tightening of controls.
Wow, that is a lot of recent movement. It really shows how quickly this space changes. So looking ahead, what should listeners be preparing for? What are those planned for change notices telling us is coming soon?
Right, planning ahead is crucial. There are several key changes announced. OS version support is shifting. Intune is planning to require iOS and iPadOS 17 or later, and macOS 14 Sonoma or later, sometime later in 2025. So organizations need to plan for OS upgrades. On the Android side, support for user-based management methods will require Android 10 or higher, and the older Android device administrator management method for devices with Google Mobile Services is ending completely on December 31st, 2024. That's a big deadline for some.
End of 2024 for Android device admin. Okay, that's important. Any network changes?
Yes, network endpoint updates. Microsoft has announced that certain network endpoints used by Intune services are changing. Organizations might need to update their firewall rules or proxy configurations by April 30, 2025 to ensure continued connectivity for managed Windows, Mac, and Android AOSP devices. Worth checking the documentation on that.
Good heads up on firewall rules. What else is on the roadmap?
We're expecting more granular controls around Apple's new AI features on iOS iPadOS, things like Genmojis, the new writing tools. Admins will get MAM policies to block or allow these within protected apps. Also related to that, controls for blocking screen capture within protected apps on iOS iPadOS, and importantly, introducing user alerts so they know when screen capture is being blocked by policy. And then there's a really significant security change coming by February 11, 2025. It's called Critical Certificate Strong Mapping.
Certificate strong mapping. What does that entail?
It means that for SCP and PKCS certificates delivered by Intune, if they're used for authentication by Microsoft Entra hybrid joined users or devices, those certificates must contain a specific security identifier, SID extension, that strongly maps the certificate to the user or device in Entra ID. If the certificate can't be strongly mapped after that date, authentication attempts using it will simply be denied. This requires planning, especially around your certificate authority configuration.
That sounds like a potentially breaking change if not prepared for. Anything else major?
One more on the iOS enrollment front. Web-based device enrollment is set to become the default method for enrolling personally owned BYOD, iOS, and iPadOS devices. This method requires deploying the single sign-on SSO extension policy to enable just-in-time or JIT registration during enrollment. So admins need to make sure that SSO extension policy is ready if they rely on BYOD iOS enrollment.
Okay, lots to keep track of there. Finally, just to place Intune in the bigger picture. How does it really fit within the whole Microsoft ecosystem? Its relationship with Entra ID, and maybe for orgs still using it, SCCM co-management.
Yeah, it's crucial to understand Intune doesn't live in a vacuum. A key point is that Intune is fundamentally 100% dependent on Microsoft Entra ID. All targeting users, groups, devices, all the management objects, they live in Entra ID. Device enrollment always, without exception, results in a device object being created or updated in Entra ID. They're intrinsically linked. Now, regarding SCCM co-management, for organizations still using Config Manager alongside Intune, the recommended strategy for transitioning fully to the cloud is generally to gradually shift the management workloads, things like patching, app deployment, policy management from SCCM over to Intune, one workload at a time. This phased approach aims to minimize disruption for end users and IT staff as the organization modernizes its endpoint management towards cloud-native Intune.
Right. Well, we have certainly covered a lot of ground today. We've navigated through the huge landscape of Microsoft Intune, from its basic principles, its core components, through its security capabilities, digging deep into enrollment, especially that very tricky world of hybrid Entra ID join. And we also got to look at some advanced analytics and a glimpse into the future with all the recent updates and upcoming changes.
Absolutely. The world of endpoint management, it's definitely complex, it's definitely dynamic. Hopefully this deep dive has armed you with some key insights, maybe a few surprising facts, and just a practical understanding you can really use to stay ahead of the curve.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. As our device ecosystems just keep getting more diverse, Linux, ARM, IoT maybe next, and as AI gets woven deeper and deeper into these management tools, what do you think will be the next biggest challenge, or maybe the biggest opportunity, in endpoint administration? How are organizations going to strike that balance between really robust security and a truly seamless, productive user experience in these increasingly intelligent, increasingly interconnected environments? Something to think about.